This is News Center 7.
Changes in Ohio law are leading to a new trend in Montgomery County courts. People beating murder charges using self-defense laws.
Yeah, in just the last 3 weeks, juries have found 2 people not guilty of murder charges.
On News Center 7's Mike Campbell joins us live. Mike, I know you talked with prosecutors and defense lawyers about a trend which included a woman investigators accused in a deadly shooting last year.
Yeah, in that case, James, began when a couple went to a Christmas party a year ago that was recorded on Facebook Live. It led to disagreements that ended when a woman fired a fatal shot while she was sitting in her car that was stopped at a stop sign. And the fatal shooting certainly had a closer examination of Ohio's changing self-defense and stand your ground laws.
That's part of the cinder block. She's still throwing it at the truck. Now she's throwing bricks at him.
Dayton defense lawyer Patrick Mulligan shows us some of the cell phone video that played a role in the jury finding his client, Georgia Jackson, not guilty of murder.
No offers were made. This was self-defense, pure and simple.
Mulligan told me that Jackson and her boyfriend were spotted at a Christmas party last year on a social media recording. Her boyfriend's ex immediately began harassing and threatening them. She slashed their tires, punched out windows in their vehicle, and continued with friends to harass them when a tow truck arrived.
She's killed that window. She's trying to break that one.
Mulligan said the woman then followed Jackson and her boyfriend as they left in a different vehicle and blocked them in at a stop sign. The woman then headed straight for Jackson with a makeshift weapon in her hand. Jackson fired her legally registered gun from inside her vehicle, and her attacker died.
One of the presumptions in the law is that if you are in your vehicle, you are using self-defense.
Mulligan said self-defense laws changed in Ohio in April of last year. Stand your ground laws also changed, where people no longer have a duty to retreat. The Montgomery County prosecutor told me, in reviewing cases, we look at the actions and the conduct of both the perpetrator and the victim at the time of the offense to determine if there is a legitimate affirmative defense. We expect to see a significant increase in self-defense claims under this new law. It's already happening. A jury just found this man, 31-year-old Aaron Vance, not guilty of murder after a fatal stabbing in May of 2021 at a Troy Street convenience store. Police said he argued with a man in the parking lot, and the jury believed his lawyer's claims of self-defense.
My experience with juries is they really try to make the right decision.
Back live, Mulligan believes the jury balanced the scales of justice correctly in his recent case, but he says it has to be the right set of circumstances. He said he believes juries will see through false claims of self-defense. Reporting live in downtown Dayton, Mike Campbell, News Center 7.